Yeah. So now our last speaker is Alex Wolfers. Alex's paper is entitled Swaraj, Socialism and the Origins of Sri Aurobindo's Political Theology. Alex is researching the early political theology of Aurobindo at King's College, University of Cambridge. He works on the intersection between theology and global intellectual history, with particular emphasis on conceptions of struggle, sovereignty, and revolutionary subjectivity. His publications include Born Like Krishna in the Prison House, Revolutionary Asceticism in the Political Ashram of Aurobindo Goza, South Asia, and The Making of an Avatar, Reading Sri Aurobindo, Religions of South Asia.
Despite his elite background, for the first 35 years of his life, Aurobindo lived in relative obscurity. Although he had been groomed for a prestigious role in the Indian civil service, he shied away from the public spotlight, choosing instead to bury himself in poetic composition and academic exploration, while employed as a teacher in quiet Baroda. But it was only really in March 1906, with the great political outburst provoked by Viceroy Lord Curzon's unpopular decision to partition Bengal the previous year, that Aurobindo was lured to Calcutta, the tumultuous epicenter of the colonial encounter, where he began to give public expression to his distinctive evolutionary vision. In this paper, I am not going to factor in the various ways that Aurobindo's thought developed in Pondicherry in the later years of his life, or even how he reformulated it through the pages of Karma Yogin in 1909, after his decisive year in the Alipur jail following the collapse of the Swadeshi-Boycott Movement. In such a short paper, I've restricted myself as a historian of ideas to his foundational moment as a visionary thinker, the earliest period of his emergence as a philosopher of political action between March 1906 and May 1908. I'm most interested here in Aurobindo's first attempts in the revolutionary Bande Mataram newspaper to articulate a strategic alternative to colonial liberalism and introduce in Bengal a bold utopian horizon of transformative freedom, or Swaraj. What does this first tragic-heroic attempt to imagine the impossible, to envisage a different planetary future from that being imposed by the imperial powers of his day, tell us about the limits and possibilities of this vision? How might a deeper understanding of the role of spirituality in his politics inform us about the politics of his spirituality? What can be learned from the tensions between a sublimated universal ideal and the concrete particularities of class, caste, and religion that obstruct its realization? Since the 1880s, middle-class Bengalis had seen their ambitions systematically thwarted by the increasingly racist and exclusionary dynamics within colonial life. Devastating famines throughout the 90s had also exposed the utter indifference of the imperial project towards the impoverished Indian masses. In 1905, the outgoing viceroy, George Nathaniel Curzon, a famously arrogant conservative imperialist, decided to partition the province of Bengal, intending to weaken middle-class resistance to British rule. Unapologetic in his disdain for Indian political aspirations, Curzon's hugely unpopular act had the unexpected result of throwing the existing political order into crisis and bursting open vast new horizons of possibility. Before partition, political activism was restricted to a narrow sphere of elite deliberation. Since Indian participants lacked the power to enforce their demands on the colonial state, they cloaked their protests and petitions in an obsequious rhetoric, abstract, highly anglicized, and purely aspirational. Curzon's partition revealed the hollowness of this kind of wish fulfillment. It demonstrated the need for a qualitatively different form of politics with an independent foundation. For the rising generation of middle-class Bengalis, who were quickly identified as the extremists, that alternative power source would be found not in Britain, but in themselves, in a program of self-reliance and in the uneducated masses. However, in 1906, the British Liberal Party took power in an electoral landslide. Alongside Curzon's replacement, Viceroy Minto, an ascendant Liberal Party appointed the veteran Liberal politician John Morley to be Secretary of State for India. Morley, a disciple of the liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill, had a reputation for principled statesmanship, and his selection again partially revived the hopes of the older, more established Bengali politicians, the moderates. It was this uncertain and fluctuating context that drew Aurobindo back to Calcutta. In August 1906, a few months after his return, extremist leaders launched the Bande Mataram, an English-language nationalist daily, with the potential to act as a mouthpiece for their emerging faction. Recognizing Aurobindo's obvious ability, intellectually and poetically, they soon elected him as its de facto editor. Under Aurobindo, the paper cleaved a distinctive path, striving to shatter the comfortable consensus around British shibboleths and entirely destroy the status of loyalty to the colonial government. He was unflinching in his iconoclasm. Much to the discomfort of many political collaborators, Aurobindo's excoriating condemnations of the older moderate leadership combined a furious idealism or impassioned spirituality with a commitment to democratic empowerment, arguing with consistent clarity and coherence why and how another future was possible. It was Aurobindo, above all others, who struggled to establish the previously unthinkable ideal of absolute Swaraj, complete, unqualified independence from the British Empire. As the movement developed and its tensions exacerbated, the moderates defined themselves as cultured middle-class liberals, interested in gradual progress, while they criticized the extremists as wild dreamers in pursuit of cheap popularity among an easily excitable mob. In reality, both factions were severely limited by their partial middle-class Hindu character, and it was ultimately the inability of Swadeshi activists to consolidate their movement around an emancipatory program for the immiserated Bengali peasantry, predominantly lower caste or Muslim, that led to the collapse of the boycott. In fact, while they repeatedly appealed to the masses as an abstraction, they ultimately proved far more anxious about awakening the supposed fanaticism of the Muslim peasant, a fear rooted in their class and religious blinkers. At the same time, rising industrial unrest throughout this critical period presented an alternative model of political mobilization, and official reports blamed the general excitement created by the agitation for a series of industrial strikes that followed partition. The extremists in particular were held responsible for the formation of several labor unions. For Aurobindo, the previous shallow appreciation of political forces had to be replaced immediately by a deeper recognition of material interests and the great reservoir of potential strength that the strikes had revealed. Political moderates were a hybrid species, emotionally nationalist while intellectually loyalist, their politics utterly lacking any solid foundation. Men like these could not be permitted to, quote, confine politics within those holy limits governed by autocratic methods and dishonest maneuvers. Expediency is not the sole god of politics, but a subordinate guide, itself determined by higher considerations. The political arena was not a social drawing room for the interchange of courtly amenities, and the desire to be always pleasant and polite should not blunt political ideals. While older opportunistic leaders chased after public opinion in the spirit of a banya or merchant by grudging, limited, and carefully calculated sacrifices, unquote, Aurobindo's democratic revolution derived its authority from the, quote, concrete lessons of history and the facts of human nature and human experience, unquote. In May 1907, the moderate faith in Morley's principled liberalism was severely strained when he sanctioned the deportation without trial of Lala Lajpat Rai, a widely respected Punjabi politician. Aurobindo led the charge. Beneath Morley's, quote, sanctimonious mask of liberalism was the harsh and terrible reality that the Indian Penal Code was just a triumph of civilized savagery, maintained by an oppressive police force, unquote. While the much-vaunted impartiality of British justice might once have satisfied the need of British imperialism to justify itself, this, quote, cloak of self-righteousness and benevolence was simply a means to indulge in selfish spoliation, propelled by the principle of might is right. In British politics, the only reality behind the tinsel and trappings of the stage was a conflict of sordid interests. In England, a sincere politician is a contradiction in terms, unquote. Back in India, Morley's proposals to slightly extend Indian representation in the British government with an advisory council of notables was yet another, quote, gilded sham, a little manipulation of light and shade, an increase in the number of dark faces, unquote. As with the moderate politician's paradoxical ideal of self-government within the empire, in Aurobindo's view of slaves politics, Morley's attempts at, quote, running with the hare while hunting with the hounds, unquote, was similarly constrained by the constitutive contradiction of imperial liberalism. Quote, the freedom of a subject race is only the freedom to starve and die, unquote. Approached correctly, with an attitude of fixed determination, persecution was likely to, quote, bring truth and sincerity into bold relief through a transformative process of purification, God's methods for separating the showy dross from the true gold. The phantasm of hollow sympathy from which Morley's sham liberalism derived its poisonous influence had ceased to haunt the Indian psyche, and the truth, Swaraj, was bursting free after the living death of a century, unquote. Repressive state violence would purge from Indians both sympathy and its associated loyalist libidinal investments, leaving in its wake a revolutionary collective ready to directly defy oppressive power. Unshackled from the, quote, cowardice of ordinary human calculations, the divine power behind the movement thus charged the masses with the courage to leap into the unknown. It is perhaps subject nations more than any other, which are found ready, unquote. On the evening of August the 16th, 1907, Aurobindo was arrested on a charge of sedition for inflammatory writings published in his Bande Mataram. Although ultimately acquitted, the trial propelled him into the public consciousness. Much of this newfound celebrity hinged on his scrupulous avoidance of the public eye until that point. Unlike most other contemporary politicians, Aurobindo stood out precisely because of his obscurity, as a, quote, hidden jewel only brought to light by circumstance, unquote. Yet the boycott was loud and messy. The previous months had continued to expose India's deep social divisions, the caste and religious fissures that frustrated the Swadeshi leadership's attempts at united political action. Now at the center of the public spotlight, the burden of proving that Swaraj was not only a message of Hindu resentment and physical force was left to Aurobindo. Around the same time, in late September 1907, Labour stalwart and democratic socialist Keir Hardie reached Calcutta as an unofficial parliamentary delegate, seeking, quote, to learn and not to teach, unquote, but also hoping to, quote, let in a little light upon the dark places of Indian government, unquote. And incidentally, both Aurobindo and Hardie were born on the 15th of August. An especially auspicious day is the date that India would ultimately gain its independence 40 years later. The previous year, Hardie had attained an elevated status in Britain, having for the first time established the Labour Party as a significant parliamentary force during the 1906 general election. Consequently, officials worried that his visit would inevitably renew hopes which were being gradually abandoned amongst the middle classes, resulting in an even greater level of disappointment, bitterness, and disaffection. On his tour through Bengal, he was courageous enough to make the radical argument that, quote, the people of India should have the largest possible form of home rule, unquote, and pledged dramatically to, quote, try and make Indians free citizens under the British flag as Canada and the colonies were. What is good for the people of Canada must be good for the people of India, unquote. Referring to Morley's strategic use of repression to crush the new political spirit, he denounced, quote, the Russian method of administration in evidence, unquote, and described Calcutta as, quote, a city in a state of siege, unquote. Back in Britain, his professions of solidarity provoked a slew of furious demands to deport the traitor immediately. In response to the charge that he had betrayed the principles of a lifetime, Morley rebutted Hardie's, quote, dangerous comparisons, unquote, insisting that he, quote, would not be hurried by the anger of impatient idealists, unquote. Until diverse India had patiently evolved, quote, a true political personality, to generalize all the conclusions from one particular case was to claim that a fur coat for the Canadian winter would suit the parched Indian subcontinent, unquote. Altogether unimpressed by Morley's pragmatic liberalism, Aurobindo railed against his, quote, slippery philosophy of the turncoat, unquote, which reduced his supposedly timeless principles to, quote, a fur coat, worn for comfort and convenience. In seeking justification for his career of cynical violence using sophist phrases, Morley was serving the devil in the name of God. If Morley-esque liberalism named that strange combination of autocracy, selfishness, repression, and sympathy, the patronizing benevolence of the master possessed of absolute power over the slave, it lacked the true liberal enthusiasm of socialists like Hardy, the interest of whose creed was bound up with the progress of internationalism, unquote. In contrast with the socialists, Morley was the, quote, avatar of a cold, philosophic liberalism, inextricable from the materialistic, agnostic, scientific enlightenment of modern Europe, with its arrogant and exclusive grounding in European prejudice. There is no practical equality, for principles are universal, but their application is to be confined to Europe, unquote. Nevertheless, Aurobindo was insistent that despite Morley's hostility towards Hardy for having, quote, dared to tell the truth about British rule in all its ugliness, ultimately imperialism was far above party, and even the Labourites, although somewhat estranged from the interests of the moneyed classes, bound up as it was in the continuance of arbitrary British domination, would ultimately, inevitably only act in their own self-interest, unquote, not that of the Indian masses. Whereas in the selfish West, life was, quote, small, rapid, and short-lived, propelled by the sordid interests of commerce or capital, the humanitarian and socialistic aspect of Eastern civilization gave it an unconquerable vitality. Asia has never embraced an ideal without universalizing it, unquote. As the Swadeshi-Boycott movement developed, while criticism of the agitators intensified for neglecting the necessary constructive work required to socially uplift the Indian masses, and chasing after a, quote, purely negative and barren form of violent boycott, unquote, Aurobindo reformulated the Bande Mataram's, quote, political gospel around his firm conviction that Indian liberation had to be in the interests of all humanity, unquote. In fact, implicit in Aurobindo's prophecy of the coming, quote, Eastern Renaissance was a militant desire for a spiritual, imperial expansion, unquote. And in this, he was building on Bengali figures like Vivekananda and Ramakrishna before him. The coming, quote, Asiatic revival and the inevitable rise of an Eastern vanguard of nations, unquote, including China, Japan, Persia, and even Afghanistan, would lay the foundation for, quote, the next great stage of human progress, a spiritual, moral, and psychical advance organized around the Vedantic gospel of equality. Whereas socialism was an essentially Asiatic and especially Indian ideal, democracy, the natural bent of Mohammedanism, was now the rising force throughout Asia. Indeed, the fundamental tendency of Hinduism was to subordinate the material to the spiritual, and its fulfillment would involve the fulfillment of the highest tendencies of human civilization, meaning the perfection of democracy and socialism. Without socialism, democracy would remain a tendency. Socialistic democracy is therefore the only true democracy, unquote. However, if the Swadeshi leadership could be scolded by the Anglo-Indian press for their, quote, anarchic demands and social nihilism, unquote, in the very next moment they were accused of exploiting the, quote, grim superstitions and demoralizing tyranny of Indian social lords to move the masses, unquote, while concealing themselves behind the progressive, quote, political catchwords of the West, unquote. How should we regard this tension? Aurobindo's Bande Mataram, for instance, even mounted a defense of an idealized caste system as a source of, quote, moral and spiritual strength, with the true socialistic aim of instilling a sense of duty into the social order, unquote. This expression of romantic apologism becomes all the more problematic when we take into account the extent to which the Swadeshi movement derived most of its undeniable coercive force from the actually existing hierarchies of caste. In a letter to the paper, one critical reader charged its editorial team with seeking, quote, shelter in the hyperphysical region of the Vedantic doctrine whenever any question, social or political, of vital importance presented itself, unquote, challenging them to unequivocally declare whether they were more interested in, quote, advocating the introduction of Western socialism by preaching its gospel of social chaos, or whether they held more faith in the theory of heredity and the preservation of a national individuality, unquote. In response, Aurobindo contrasted the idealized, quote, distribution of spiritual, moral, and practical duties within an ancient caste hierarchy with its modern distortion into caste arrogance, exclusiveness, and superiority, unquote. Against this romanticized past, the present forms of, quote, fixed hereditary and anti-democratic caste organization were degenerate perversions, inconsistent with the basic spirit of Hinduism, unquote. However, Aurobindo argued that unlike, quote, the ordinary unthinking social reformer who put the cart before the horse, the indispensable precondition for the necessary program of state-led social transformation was political emancipation. The principle once realized in politics must inevitably assert itself in society through a transformation of spirit, and not merely of machinery. Independent India would embrace the most vital impulses of modern life, and direct its essential equality into the pliable, self-adapting democratic distribution of function at which socialism aims. The moral, intellectual, and spiritual perfection of mankind, unquote. By early 1908, in the final months before the boycott movement was brought to a sudden halt, and Aurobindo himself was sent to the infamous Alipur jail, he made his closing pleas for revolution. Swaraj should not be understood as mere political freedom, or even spiritual freedom. At its center must sit the social freedom preached by reformers like Buddha, Chaitanya, Nanak, and Kabir, the spiritualization of the world through India in an infinite application of the Vedantic ideals of liberty, equality, and above all, fraternity. Even while the, quote, common sense, unquote, politicians and the petty shopkeepers of the world, quote, poured scorn on our prophetic visions, unquote, those committed to Swaraj must open themselves to, quote, a wider horizon, unquote, beyond the pulls of race and religion, caste, and capitalism. So what was Aurobindo's original contribution to the formation of an autonomous Indian political arena during its founding moment? And by extension, how did Bengali nationalism fit into the wider political scene? I think most importantly was his commitment to a militant idealism and a sublimating spiritual impulse, even when discussing violence. At the same time, he was one of the thinkers most committed to revolution, that is to say, to imposing his radical analysis and universal vision on the stubborn status quo. But this spiritualized politics was not an escape into abstraction or magical thinking. Things do not happen just because we want them to. That was a tendency he most associated with liberalism, insofar as it emphasized pragmatism over principle and civility over clarity. The preference within liberalism for representation, instead of direct democracy, tended towards institutionalism and autocratic behaviors, while the lofty abstractions of liberals frequently masked their selfish and cynical material interests. Democratic empowerment, therefore, was the best means to establish Asia's awakening on a firm footing, and the key to this he found in socialism. Against the abstract universalism projected by imperial liberals, reliant on a false and hollow rhetoric of sympathy, Aurobindo presented his spiritual universalism as a far more inclusive alternative, informed by a framework of democratic socialism, a substantive universalism, and a spirituality that demanded its realization in dynamic, creative action. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We'll take questions at this time.
Thank you, Alex. And it's lovely to see you after such a long time. Yeah. A brilliant, beautiful talk. I wanted to, and it awakens so much because I've been spending time in Bengal back and forth over the last year. And so much is going on over there. And you can see the seeds of what began at that time still alive in various ways over there. One of the things that your talk kind of brings, there's a couple of things I wanted to draw on. One is this idea of a spiritualized socialism, which sort of forms in a way the kind of message that Sri Aurobindo was trying to draw on in the Bande Mataram. Would you say it's a continuation of Vivekananda's ideas, but in a more radicalized and kind of universalized way?
In some sense, although, I think that, so the engagement with the universal and Vedantic idealism, in Vivekananda's thinking, it was very much rooted in, foregrounded, not just rooted, but really foregrounded in his individualism, his militant individualism as this kind of strong revolutionary sannyasi, which I've talked about elsewhere. But with Aurobindo, there's this, I guess, the question of, and just to go back, so the revolutionary sannyasi figure is something that I see in how Aurobindo's ideas do develop later, with the idea of a divine anarchy much more focused on the individual, and the kind of freedom of those choices and interactions the individual is able to make. But with Aurobindo in this critical Bande Mataram period, I think the aspect of socialism is, it brings in the collective, it brings in the democratic, which is Vivekananda makes a few statements here and there, but it's not so central. So the idea of viewing the emergence of spirit as a kind of historical force, the world-changing transformative force, as something that emerges through things like strikes. That's very new. That's a very unique to that Swadeshi moment thing.
Yeah, interesting. The other side of it was I think I heard you say in your phrasing, I heard you say something about the imperial aspect of kind of an expansionist socialistic idea, spiritual socialism as a kind of a Asiatic, expansionist imperial idea. And it sort of brought to mind the whole notion of Pan-Asianism and how it turns into an imperial expansionist idea through the First and Second World Wars coming out of Japan. Can you say something more about that? Do you think that the seeds of that are also present in this kind of thinking? And is it a shared sort of notion? Because to some extent, Sri Aurobindo is also drawing on people like Okakura who have come and gone by the time he's doing his work.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think that the imperial aspect is something I would definitely relate to Vivekananda, and before him, the Brahmo Samaj, the idea of these missionaries. So this revolutionary sannyasi concept is something that I think you can trace it back to a missionary concept. So the figure of the kind of hyper-masculine missionary who was going into the frontiers, away from the center, away from comfort, respectability, but charging out there into the wilderness to bring some kind of civilizing impulse. Obviously, the reality of it was brutality, but there is this kind of idealization that is going on from even evangelical Christianity. So Vivekananda changes that, tries to repivot it in various ways. Civilization becomes something much more to do with self, rather than the British civilization, this very kind of cookie cutter enforced Anglo-centric civilization. But yeah, the idea of this expansive, in Vivekananda's terms, it's aggressive Hinduism. which doesn't mean what it sounds like it means, which is more like Hindutva today, but it's actually supposed to be something much more just missionary in terms of the best aspects of our human experience are being brought elsewhere, not through violence. So there's a whole different economy being developed, not through brute material force, but through a spiritual economy somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because it you know, these ideas are so fertile and they open themselves up in so many different directions, just like you're saying about they could end up becoming Hindutva on the one hand, but it you know, what say somebody like Vivekananda was thinking about was something slightly different, something much more internal in a sense. In the same way as the notion of an Asiatic identity becomes radicalized and becomes something much more aggressive in, say, Japan. But you can see some of the seeds already, and a different type of manifestation of the same thing, which is present in the Bande Mataram.
Yeah, I mean, just to make one further point about the imperialism is that, I mean, it is interesting because you do keep seeing the imperialism of it recurring. So it's a theme in my writings, but it's something that offsets the nationalistic. So instead of being a nationalistic move, it's an imperial move, which is actually in some ways more pluralistic. It's a move away from ethno-nationalism. India was considered an impossible nation because of the pluralities involved, caste, religious. So people used to constantly mock it for not being able to ever be a nation. So in a sense, India was, rather than a nation, it was an empire in itself. But that circle can expand to something more or something less, to the self. I mean, it's much more than it literally seems, the imperial.
Yeah, I mean, the Sanskrit idea of Swaraj, as you brought it out, and Sri Aurobindo nuances it further in his later writings, Swaraj and Samraj, looking at the Veda. That is the sort of imperialism of the self, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of idea than that of nationalism. And I think it's a very interesting and nuanced idea. I mean, because people normally think of imperialism also as a kind of a, autocratic imposition, right?
Yeah.
So I think it requires a kind of discursive, sort of elaboration in itself, probably.
It's the relationship between the center and the periphery.
Right.
With a kind of a kingless empire.
Yes.
With a decentered empire, there's something else going on, full of potentials, post-national, whatever it is, but it's...
Yes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Alex, I have a quick question. It's a little bit of an aside, but it came up in my mind. But in terms of the militant sannyasi, and I came across Sri Aurobindo's translation of Ananda Mat, and I was just wondering if you could talk how that influenced him in those times, and maybe even a little bit about that book in general, how it influenced the larger movements in India.
Yeah, it's a slightly trickier one, insofar as the book is written by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, novelist. It's where Bande Mataram, the song, comes from. But it's based on another Scottish novel, in which warrior monks rise up to confront a hostile power coming from outside. But Bankim Chandra Chatterjee was a kind of quite a frightened clerk, and as a result, he was very frightened of the British censorship. So he shifted the enemies that the monks were fighting against, so that it wasn't the British as much as a Muslim enemy. It was a kind of intimate enemy, to use the Ashish Nandi phrase. But so a group of militant monks rise up. They learn to discipline themselves, cultivate a certain inner power, but they direct that violence, that kind of that sublimated violence, at Muslims rather than at the British. So it's a very problematic text. There's this kind of problematic ambivalence right at the heart of this whole formation. So I tend to put Bankim down as more on the revivalist side. So there's all these ingredients moving into this ideological configuration that is Swadeshi. Bankim I would put more on that side of things. The revivalist, the kind of cultural chauvinist conservative side that is trying to discipline the Muslim peasant rather than trying to elevate and universalize the ideals. But at the same time, Swami Vivekananda, so when was it? 1893 was when he goes to the World Parliament. And so he is right, he's after, and then that's what elevates him, that's what makes him famous, which is after Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. So then he returns to India, he dies in 1902. So his ideas are very much fresh in the mind of particularly the Bengali youth. So there is this youth icon of Swami Vivekananda who was able to stand up and confront this militant sannyasi who was able to stand up and confront the empire right from the periphery to the center. He is able to make that journey and be defiant. And he does it in a more universalistic way, a more spiritually open way. So there's Bankim and then there's Vivekananda, and they're both shifting into this ideological assemblage. Vivekananda still somewhat chauvinistic at times, but much more of this idealist versus Bankim's conservatism. And so they're both part of the Anandamath vision, really, because it's a vision of, becomes in Swadeshi a vision of Vivekananda's brotherhood standing up against the British.
Thank you. It's fascinating. Yeah. We still have time if anybody wants to type in a question.
I see that there's a hand up, but if you could type your question and we will read it.
Okay, well, we have a couple hands, and let's try this. We haven't been doing this, but I know that Bauman has a question, and we're going to allow him to talk. Here he is. Bauman, you can unmute yourself. Okay, no, he's not responding. Okay, we can try this.
In the meantime, I was just going to mention, so Vivekananda's brother is actually one of Aurobindo's terrorist group. So he claims to be the editor of a journal, a revolutionary vernacular journal that is run by Aurobindo's brother. So Vivekananda's brother and Aurobindo's brother are both working within this revolutionary journal that is repressed in around the same time Aurobindo is sent to prison the first time, before he becomes a celebrity. And Aurobindo, and I've written about this elsewhere, but Aurobindo basically gets him to dress and comport himself in the same kind of way, like a sannyasi. So he's on trial, and he presents himself as a sannyasi on trial, standing for Swaraj against empire. So it's an interesting way in which the dynamics of spirituality versus material brutal force are directly being dramatized through Aurobindo, who's just behind it, just pushing people into this stage.